My name is Ben Smith. I work at Google on the Chrome team, on the WebAssembly team. I'm also the WebAssembly chair of the WebAssembly working group and the WebAssembly community group. So this talk will be about the community group. I see some people who have been to the community group, so you probably know a lot of what I'm going to say. But I think a lot of you probably haven't been, and it'll be interesting and maybe even exciting. We'll see. All right, maybe that's overstating it. So here's the agenda for this talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the community group, what it is, who it is, so on. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the community group, and then talk about our VC meetings, our video conference meetings, then our in-person meetings. I'm going to talk about the proposal process, how we make changes to WebAssembly, and then I'm going to talk specifically about the June meeting, which we just had a few weeks ago. By the way, the pictures in the back of all of these slides are from the June meeting in A Coruña. So if you have any questions about those, actually, if you have questions about anything, just call it out. It's better to just do it live rather than wait until the end. So let's do that. So first, the community group. So first thing you should know about the community group is what it is. And it's actually pretty simple. WebAssembly is an open standard developed by a number of people through the W3C. And so what the community group tries to do is be open to as many people as possible, moving WebAssembly forward through proposals, adding new features to WebAssembly. So who can join? Anyone, but you have to sign a CLA. That's a contributor license agreement. All that means basically is that if you're going to contribute source code or design ideas, we get the permission to use those ideas for WebAssembly. I'm not a lawyer, so obviously go look at that, but that's the idea. How often does the group meet? So we have two different types of meetings. We have video conference meetings and we have in-person meetings. The video conference meetings occur every 2 weeks. We had the last one, I guess, about a month ago. In fact, today was supposed to be the day that we were going to have another video conference meeting, but we don't typically do one very close to an in-person meeting. So we skipped that one today. The next one will be July 9th. So if you're interested, send me an email and I can add you to the meeting invite. The in-person meetings, we generally do about 2 a year. It can be anywhere in the world. So we always look for a host, very much like Jonathan. We have to find a host to supply a space. I'll talk a little bit about the host requirements later. So where does the group meet? Like I said, the VC meetings, we use Zoom. It's actually pretty convenient for us. It allows a good number of people to sign in and chat and so on. And again, the in-person meetings can be anywhere, but they require a host. Picture in the background here is actually an obelisk and a reflecting pool in A Coruña. It's hard to tell because the obelisk is clipped, but it actually keeps going up from there. So how can you join? Well, this is the website. You can see there's not a lot there. Mostly it's just the site, but that's the place where you can join. And once you join, like I said, you can contact me. The email is on that site, and I will add you to the meeting if you want to be added. Any questions about this so far before I move on? Pretty basic stuff. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the history. So the community group was first proposed in April 2015. We knew that we wanted WebAssembly to be a standard, so an open standard. So we decided to sort of pick and choose which group would be best. There are a number of standardization bodies. We went with the W3. And at the time, it was decided that it was actually good to go with a process where we separated the community group from a working group. A lot of standardization bodies actually have do most of their work in the working group. The problem with the working group, using that model, there's nothing too bad about it, but it does mean that it's hard for anybody to just join. The community group is actually a nice mechanism to allow anybody to join and contribute ideas, and then pass the ideas on to the working group later. So our first official community group meeting was actually 2 years later. So you might wonder why that was. When we were developing the idea, we found that it was actually, it was such a small group that we mostly did a lot of the work on GitHub issues directly, and just by having conversations between a lot of the groups that standardized that originally proposed the idea of WebAssembly. So that was primarily the browser creators from the major browsers at the time. Since then, we've had 81 meetings, 74 VC meetings, and 7 in-person meetings. So this picture in the background here is actually Pulpo, the octopus. So this is right along the water. Actually, it's a beautiful, beautiful little stroll in A Coruña. So in 2017, we had the most meetings. You can see they were all in America. We try not to do that as much because we do have a number of people contribute in from other places in the world. But at the time, this was convenient. So yeah, we had a lot more meetings in 2017. 2017 was actually the year that WebAssembly MVP first was sort of announced. And so there was a lot to still sort of discuss about how do we move the spec forward, how do we want to actually run our meetings, and so on. So meeting in person actually was very convenient. And in 2018, we had just 2 meetings. The first one was at Fastly, just not too far away from here. And then the second one was actually at TPAC. TPAC is the W3 conference where we get together and we discuss all number of ideas that are sort of being discussed in that standardization body. It's very useful for web technologies to all get together and sort of make sure that we're all working in the same direction. We're trying to make the web platform a really great platform. So we had that one, and that was in Lyon, France. And the picture in the background here is actually, well, it's a funicular, right? So if you're looking this way, I guess the octopus was this way. So it goes up the hill, but it was actually broken at the time, I believe. So I didn't get to ride it. So this year we've only had 1 meeting, A Coruña, Spain, at the Igalia offices, and that was, like I said, just a couple weeks ago. We may have another one this year. If we do, we still don't have a host, so if anybody wants to host a meeting, come and talk to me, and I can try and make that work out. But yeah, if we don't have one this year, we probably will have one maybe at the beginning of next year. Try and do it early. We don't want to space it out too much more than that. Questions so far? So we actually have 19 active proposals currently. Proposals are the way that we advance WebAssembly, as I mentioned. And you can go to this website and you can see the status of each of the different proposals. They're pretty hard to understand if you don't really know WebAssembly that well, but we try and have an overview that explains a lot of what's going on with those. So go and check that out. The picture in the background here is a couple of my coworkers. We were hanging out late at night. What was this, like midnight maybe? And they had a nice little sculpture garden here that was pretty cool. So this is Wouter and Sam. All right, so now on to the VC meetings and talking about how we run those. All right, so when are the VC meetings? Like I said, they're always on a Tuesday. We try and do them every 2 weeks as long as we have enough content for that meeting. The way that we add content to the meeting is that we have a GitHub repository. It's github/webassembly/meetings. And you just file a PR and add it. And actually, if you don't want to do that, some people don't really like doing Git stuff. you can send me an email and I can add that stuff in too. And we do them all at 9 a.m. Pacific time, and that does actually change with daylight savings time. And we run the meetings for about an hour. So we try and actually be pretty on schedule for this stuff. If we end up going over an hour, well, we try never to go over an hour. So yeah. So what happens at a VC meeting? Pretty basic stuff, honestly. We take attendance, it's pretty important. We read through the agenda, and then we follow up on action items for the previous meeting, and then we go through the agenda items in order. Like, do I really need a slide for this? Maybe not, but here it is. And there's a cool sort of demon creature in the background there, so maybe you can look at that instead if this is too obvious for you. So here are some of the things that we might see at a CG meeting. The first thing is presentations. So often the presentations that we have at the meeting aren't necessarily about moving a proposal forward. They might just be something that's interesting to the group. So for example, if you're somebody who's using WebAssembly and you think maybe the group might be curious about how you're using it, if you're using it in a different sort of way than other people do, then you can talk to me and I can set up a meeting for that. But like, yeah, as it says, it's not necessarily related to a proposal. It could be about anything. We've had a few people come and do it, often academics talking about research topics, but it really could be anything. Another thing we have are discussions. So this is more like, rather than talking about a particular proposal, it may be just something like somebody in the group has a question that they want to bring to the community group. Maybe they don't know exactly how to move forward and they want to have a bit more information about how to do that. So often it's very open-ended. It may not actually have a conclusion. We may just sort of gather some information and at the end we'll just sort of cut it off when it seems like people are spinning their wheels a little bit. That does happen, especially with a lot of people who are technical and can see all the details and everything. The picture in the background here is a group of young kids. They're all wearing green hats for some reason. I don't know why. And then up on the wall are actually these really cool glass windows on this building. And there's an interesting history there, but I forgot it. So I guess you'll have to just look it up. Again, this is in A Coruña. It's a very beautiful city. I'm not sure if you can tell from the pictures, but it was very nice. Any questions about any of this so far? Okay. Yes, no? No, you can't do it. Okay. And so one of the things that you'll often see in the meetings is polls. This is more of a directed question. So the idea is that you come to the group and you want to say, does the group agree with this or not? Yes or no question. So as it says here, should we do this? And the way we do this is by going through and these lists here, SF, F, NA, and SA, represent strongly in favor, favor, neutral, against, and strongly against. The idea is that we just go through, we ask everybody. If it's a VC meeting, then we will ask people to add it in chat. And if it's an in-person meeting, we will ask people to raise their hands. And the idea is to try and come to some kind of consensus, but it's not necessary to come to consensus. And in fact, if people are against, then we will often ask those people if they have a reason that they're against, if there's something that they want to communicate into the notes. It hasn't happened recently. In fact, in the June meeting, nobody was against anything, which was pretty cool, but also maybe a little bit weird. So, but it has happened in the past, and it's useful. It's very important that people feel like they can say, I don't like this idea. You don't necessarily even have to have a good reason, but it helps. All right, in-person meetings. Let's talk about how those work. So when are they? Like I said, we try and do twice a year, although you saw that sometimes it's 4 times a year, sometimes it's once, like this year. And they're 2 to 3 days. So yeah, they're pretty long days, 6 to 7 hours per day. And and it is always on a weekday. We don't want people, burning their weekends for these meetings. You get to take your work time. And the idea is that in a lot of ways, it's just an extended version of a VC meeting. Right, same as the VC meeting, it's just 7 times longer. We do have breaks for lunch and breaks for food and bio breaks, as I like to call them, although apparently that's a term that a lot of people don't know. Basically, using bathroom like that. So yeah, that's what etc. means. So when we have an in-person meeting, there are a number of requirements that we have. We obviously want them to be near airports or a hotel. This should be something that people can travel to pretty easily. We need a meeting room that's large enough for 50 people. That's usually the number of people, although it has been growing. The last meeting was a little bit tight. I think some of the people in this room maybe ended up on the wall. So yeah, having a big enough room is really important. It needs to be accessible for people with disabilities. Electricity, Wi-Fi, and electricity to the seats is really important. People don't want their computers dying while they're in the meeting. And Wi-Fi, of course, because this is 2019. Presenters podium, obviously, a lot of what we do is presenting to the group. So just having a way that we can set up something very much like this, where you have microphones and you have ways to connect and present to everybody. And the picture in the background here is one that you probably have seen a few times in the pictures, which is the Tower of Hercules. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site in A Coruña. It's very pretty from the outside. I did not go inside, but some people in this room did, so you can ask them about it. It looked very, very cool. From how many years ago? Thousands of years ago. Built in the 1st century by the Romans, so pretty cool. Any questions about any of this, or maybe the Tower of Hercules? No? Okay, so more hosting requirements. Obviously, telepresence is important. We want these meetings to be accessible to people who are not able to come to the meeting, obviously. So, and people do to join in. We like to basically be able to use zoom.us for the meetings as well. It's important that you don't have any NDA required to get into the building. So, it's just people don't want to have to sign things away. It's rude. Obviously, light snacks and beverages because people don't want to be hungry during the meeting. You will be anyway, but like less hungry. And obviously, lunch options is important. With dietary restrictions. Often it's useful if the person hosting or the company hosting can provide dinner in some way. That would be great. It's not required, obviously. But yeah, it actually ends up being a great time to get everybody who is in the meeting to come together and just be able to chat. We don't really have a lot of time for people to have hallway conversations. It does happen, but you don't really want to miss things in the meeting because you might miss a poll, in which case your vote doesn't count. Matters. Any questions about any of this? Okay, let's talk about the proposal process, how we move things forward. So basically the way this happens is we start off with phase 0. Phase 0 is not really a proposal at all. It's just we have an idea. So the first step is to file an issue in the design repo. People do that a lot, actually. You'll see that, and I've filed a couple myself. And then to have a little bit of discussion on the feature on that GitHub issue. That's usually how these things start. At some point, maybe the person who filed the issue, or maybe somebody else, becomes a champion. The champion is meant to be the person who pushes this proposal forward. The idea being that, like, you don't necessarily have to do the work, but you have to push people who will do the work. So, if you're a manager, manage those people. Or if you're not a manager, become one. And then at some point, you decide maybe there's enough momentum here, and you can add that to the as an agenda item to the CG meeting, and then we'll discuss it. And then at some point, the CG, in that meeting, the CG will discuss whether or not this is an interesting topic to the group. And at that point, we will say yes or no. If we say yes, then it goes on to phase 1. If we say no, well, I guess you go to phase -1. Not actually a phase, but imagine that might be. Oh, and yeah, this picture in the background is, well, I think that one over there is me. I don't know why I look tiny. I guess it's perspective, but it doesn't it look like, I don't know. So future proposals. So at the point where you advance from phase 0 to phase 1, now it's a proposal that we've decided as a group we actually care about. We want to try and move it forward. And so at that point, we actually make a fork of the spec repo. The idea is that you should be able to make changes to the spec repo to add that new feature, whatever it may be. And actually, the spec repo includes 3 different spec documents. So if you need to make changes to JavaScript, or you need to make changes to the web part of the spec, or even the core part of the spec, you can do them all in the same repo. We always add a technical overview. The idea being that editing the spec is actually pretty difficult. It's a pretty technical document. I don't know if anyone's actually looked at the spec, but it's quite rigorous. It's meant to be useful for academics and so on. So it's useful to have an overview that's maybe a little bit more high level. People can sort of read and understand. So all of the proposals that we have now do have an overview. And at this point, often a prototype implementation begins, mostly to inform the development of the idea. So yeah, like the fourth item there, design is informed by the prototypes that happen. This can actually be kind of anywhere. There are many WebAssembly implementations, and you could do it in any one of those, and that's reasonable to do. Any questions about this slide? Let's see, shaking heads. So at this point, we're in phase 2. If we've advanced, obviously every stage of advancement requires going back to the community group and requesting to advance. At this point, phase 2, you have enough information available that implementations can actually start, more implementations can start prototyping. So the work on the spec text begins, and a test suite begins, the idea being that the implementations should all be able to pass this test suite, and this would be the way you can determine conformance to that proposal. If we advance past that stage, we get to the implementation phase. At this point, all the implementers should be starting to work on them. Obviously, some implementations might decide that they don't want to do that. That's their prerogative, obviously, but this is sort of the point at which implementations should be starting to implement. You should have tool chains implementing the feature as well as the reference interpreter implementation, which exists inside the spec repo. The idea being now that there are many implementations that are all implementing this proposal, and you can test them, and those should all work. I think I actually missed something from this one. Yeah, there should actually be spec text in this one as well. So the idea is that the actual spec text is necessary at this point as well. Implementations really don't want to be implementing features without having the spec text. Sometimes it's very difficult to know if you're doing something right if you don't have those edge cases covered. So. And then finally, this is the handoff point. So if we progress past phase 3, now we have a number of implementations, we have a proposal, everyone's excited about it, and the community group says, here, and they hand it off to the working group. At that point, the working group looks at it and says, yeah, this looks good. We're excited about this too. Or they say, actually, maybe there's some things that we need to sort of look at more carefully. So if they agree, it moves forward to phase 5. If they don't, then it actually goes back to the community group to address those concerns. And then finally, the feature is standardized. This is the point at which consensus is reached. The proposal is then merged back into the WebAssembly spec repo, the master repo, and it becomes an official feature. So far, this has happened once, but Mostly the constraints have been that the implementation constraints. Sometimes it's just hard to find enough implementers to find the time to implement some of these features. So, but a number of the proposals are actually far enough along that they could perhaps become spec. The question is, what feature is phase 5? It's mutable global import and export. That was one that was actually pretty important. We wanted to get into the version 1 of the WebAssembly spec because we were concerned that if we didn't, it would be a JavaScript, it would be a breaking change for JavaScript. So it was pretty important to make sure that we had a new type that was called WebAssembly.global that was returned if you export. So that was a bit of technical talk for this mostly non-technical talk. I apologize. All right, this is the last section. Are we on time? We're fine? Okay. The June 2019 meeting. So I'm going to go over some of the topics very briefly. If you have any questions about them, ask. Otherwise, I will move along. Important thing to note here is that nearly all of these topics have slides, but they don't have recordings. So hopefully you can get all the information that you want out of the slides. If not, a lot of the people who presented are online on GitHub, and you can ask them questions. And yeah, question? The question is, notes are not taken. I thought I had that on a slide, but yes, notes are taken at all of the meetings, the VC and the in-person meetings. And so the notes are actually available for this meeting. So that will help. But often people don't take notes on information that is in the slides. So you might have to sort of, you know, put your peanut butter and jelly together in that way. Does that analogy make sense to anybody? Okay.
The notes are available.
The notes are available on GitHub. It's on github.com/webassembly/meetings. And I have a link to that at the end of the slides. Any other questions before I rip through this? So day 1, we talked about SIMD. This is a feature that probably is interesting to a lot of people here because you're here to see Thomas talk about SIMD as well. Mostly was presented by Deepti, who is in the back of the room here, as well as Arun. And a lot of what we talked about were benchmarks. And we had a couple of polls. We removed some of the instructions, I64 and F64x2 instructions, and we actually advanced to phase 2, which is pretty great considering it had been phase 1 for a very long time. So we were very excited about that. And this is a picture actually from Barcelona, so it probably shouldn't be in this deck, but you know, Barcelona is also really nice. Any questions about this? All right, move on. You're gonna hear more about it later. Reference types. So again, we talked about reference types. It's a new feature. It's actually very useful for being able to pass things like JavaScript objects in and out of WebAssembly. And this was presented by Andreas Rosberg, who is the spec editor and also sort of chief smart guy about all things WebAssembly. I don't know if that's his official title. And he mostly did a presentation on the overview and some updates on the proposal. After that, Andreas followed it up with function references. This is very similar to reference types. In fact, it was split out of the reference types proposal. This one includes topics about how you take a function and make it first class, essentially, so that you can pass it in and out. You can take a JavaScript object, pass it into WebAssembly. You can call it directly, things like that. So Andreas presented about that. These slides are actually really cool if you're at all interested in like type theory and things like that. There's lots of good stuff here. And we actually advanced this to phase 1, which is very, very cool. This topic is sort of a grab bag of all the JavaScript and WebAssembly stuff. It was presented by Dan Ehrenberg. You might know him as Little Dan. He also is involved a lot with TC39, which is this JavaScript standardization body. And he went through many, many topics. You can see I actually didn't even have room on the slide for all the topics that he covered. In fact, I think we did half an hour and then we broke for lunch and then we did another half an hour. So there's lots of really great stuff here. The slides are very interesting, in my opinion. And there's a lot of really great stuff that this will expose to WebAssembly. So ESM integration is ECMAScript module integration. There's also top-level await. That's useful for WebAssembly being able to integrate. Get originals is being able to get the original version of some JavaScript global value. Built-in modules. Well, I'm not going to read it through it all. There's a lot of really great stuff there. So if you're interested in sort of how WebAssembly works with JavaScript, this is a good set of slides to look at. And then finally on the last topic of day one was web IDL bindings. This is another feature that's very, very important for integrating with JavaScript. If you're at all interested in taking your WebAssembly and communicating with the DOM, this is the type of topic that would be interesting to you. I don't see Jacob here, but he also he has lots of interest in that, so you might try and track him down and talk to him about it. Mostly, we did some updates here, but we also had a poll to sort of like change the direction of it. This is a proposal that's actually changed a number of times over the years. It's probably been 2.5 years in the making, but it's also a very complex proposal. So the design is actually pretty interesting, and the slides here go into a lot of detail about how that might work, communicating between different WebAssembly modules, WebAssembly and JavaScript, and so on. Any questions about any of this? Okay. And then finally on the very last topic, actually, which we added later, was how we might change the process document. So we found that our document that we originally wrote back in 2017 didn't really match the way that we did a lot of our work. And so we wanted to try and make that match a little bit closer. Okay, so I'm going to rip through day two a little bit more here. Bulk memory, this was a topic near and dear to me because I'm the champion of it. And we actually had a number of different polls to try and simplify things. Threads, this is another topic that's near and dear to me because I'm also the champion of it. And here we added a new instruction, a fence instruction, which allows you to, well, it's like a fence. It's a memory fence. We talked about a collaborative benchmark suite. So the idea here is that we all sort of work together and build up a set of benchmarks that we can use to test WebAssembly engines and determine how well we're performing not only between different WebAssembly engines, but also against native. Pretty important stuff there, and we decided we would move forward with that. We had some discussion about WebAssembly, or sorry, exception handling. We talked about the current status of the spec, as well as implementation status in V8. And we had some questions about whether or not traps should be caught. So some interesting stuff there. There are slides for this too, but I currently don't have the link. So when I get those, I will update the meetings doc. We had some discussions about debugging, very important topic to a lot of people. And we haven't made a whole lot of progress here, but we're starting to. I think people are pretty interested in making this a lot better. And so Nick Fitzgerald actually presented some pretty interesting stuff, some ideas about making a WebAssembly debugging module that you can use that's sort of like the surface between the module that you're debugging and the browser or whatever system that you're running on. And then finally, we talked about garbage collection, typed imports and exports. Again, this is a very useful feature for things like the web, where you want to be able to take a type and then pass that through into a WebAssembly module. It makes things potentially a lot faster. There's some slides on, actually no, there are not slides on this, but there's a great overview document, and we decided to move it forward to phase 1, which means that we have a forked repo of that. And then finally, we had a conversation about whether or not we're having too many damn meetings. And the answer was, maybe not, but we should be a little bit more careful about making good use of people's time. So any meeting that's less than half an hour, we may try and move those agenda items to the next meeting. And that is it. Here's some links for you if you're interested in any of this stuff. The top link is, again, the link to join the community group. The links after that are meetings, where we can add agenda items, proposals, which has the current status of all the proposals, design, which is usually the place that we discuss new proposal ideas, and then spec, which is the main WebAssembly spec repo. And that is all I got. So unless people have questions, I will end it. Question?
Sure. Thank you very much. As somebody that's involved in TC39 but not involved in W3C, I realized I'm not entirely clear on the community group, working group distinction as well as maybe I should. I found the process that you described extremely familiar, except for the extra step where the working group and community group are discussing amongst each other. But is that to say that the working group only comes into play with that final approval stage, or can you describe the interaction between the two in a little more detail?
So the basic idea is that the community group is open to nearly anyone. You basically just have to, click a little box that say, yes, I agree to the CLA, and then you can be part of the community group and you can help move proposal forward. The working group requires you to, be part of the W3 working group, which is a higher barrier. Usually an individual won't do that. It would be like a company. There's a certain amount of money you have to pay, and I'm not sure the other constraints, but it's more than that. So the distinction is meant to be sort of like to allow there to be some openness with the design of ideas, but then at some point there needs to be a process. This is the purpose of the W3, is to have that final stage. So normally these ideas in many other groups would be done entirely in the working group. And so in a way, the community group allows us to expand that out to everybody.
Cool. That's really interesting. Thanks.
Any other questions? Question there?
Curious which phase the WebIDL bindings are in?
I believe that is phase 1. Is that right? I'm seeing yeses. Yes.
Cool.
It's still pretty early. Yeah. We're hoping to try and move that forward more before the end of the year, but we'll see. Any other questions?
I have a question about interoperability and sort of the role of interoperability in the standardization process. Some standards bodies will depend on interoperability, or proving that X many implementations meet some form of interoperability or compliance. Is that something that's important? Is that more of a reference?
Yeah. So we do have a requirement for that. There has been some discussion about it, which is kind of the reason why I didn't bring it up. Currently in the proposal document, we have a requirement that 2 web VMs must implement a feature before it can move to phase 4, I believe. The issue is that now, probably as a lot of people in the room know, there are other VMs that are not web VMs that are very important to WebAssembly. And so the question is, should the nomenclature change in the process document to reflect that? Some people say that it should say 2 production VMs. Some people prefer that it's still web VMs. So this is a conversation that's still happening. There's a GitHub issue that I opened very recently about this. If you have thoughts, feel free to contribute to that. I don't have the issue in front of me, but yeah, the idea is to have some amount of consensus. The question is, does it need to be web consensus, or is it just sort of implementation feasibility? And I think that's a lot of where the difference in opinion comes in.
Thanks.
You mentioned that one of the texts you worked on is regarding changes to JavaScript. What are the interactions with TC39? That's
a really great question. Biggest interaction is that there are people who are involved in both groups. A lot of it is not direct, although I do believe there have been times when people have come from a WebAssembly group and presented in TC39 to give them some information. So for example, when we were working on WebAssembly threads, one of the researchers, Conrad Watt, and someone, Andreas Rosberg as well, found that there was an issue in the memory model. and so went to present that to TC39. So that would be one example. I think some other cases that might come up are like atomics, where, you know, obviously if you have JavaScript and WebAssembly and they're running and they both have access to the same memory, you're going to want to make sure that the atomic accesses interact properly. So that's a case where if we make changes to WebAssembly, we're going to need to also make changes to TC30 to JavaScript. And so a lot of the process is just sort of making sure that people are aware of what's happening in both places, but there's nothing official. Does that answer your question? Here.
How much representation do you see from web-focused people versus people looking at non-web use cases and implementations of WebAssembly?
We see a lot of both, to be honest. I mean, the people involved from the web are web browsers primarily. So we have representatives from Chrome and from Firefox and from WebKit and from Chakra from Edge. And from non-web, yeah, it's a lot of people from Edge and blockchain, Edge computing, and so on. And so, yeah, I feel like we see a lot of both. Maybe not as many people who are more more web focused in terms of like web technologies. Like we don't see a lot of, say, CSS people in the meeting. But yeah, I mean, we're certainly open to anybody coming to the meeting. I think one of the things that you might see is that the meeting is very much focused on sort of WebAssembly stuff, you know, sort of a low level ideas. And so some of it actually isn't particularly useful to somebody who's working many layers up the stack. That said, we do have subgroups that are designed to maybe split some of that stuff off. So for example, we don't currently have one, but WebIDL bindings is something that interacts a lot with WebIDL, as you might expect. And so that's a situation where it might be useful to have a separate group of people meeting who are interested in that topic and not as interested in, say, the memory model. Any other questions?
Cool. Awesome.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, Ben.